captive of fate. In the cold expanse of a darkened room, Samuel's consciousness stirred, groggy and disoriented. He blinked his eyes open, groaning as he struggled to move his arms, only to find them bound tightly to a metallic chair. Every surface around him gleamed under an alien glow, a mix of foreign technology and sterile steel, all tinged with an unsettling quiet. The last memory that surfaced was one of chaos, his squadron, ambushed and overwhelmed on an unfamiliar planet. They'd been caught off guard, and one by one, his comrades had fallen. Now he found himself here, alone, trapped in the clutches of a race he'd only heard about through classified reports, the Eshtari. The Eshtari were legendary, known for their cold logic, advanced technology, and brutal efficiency on the battlefield. Humanity had encountered them only recently in their cosmic ventures, and already they were feared across the galaxies for their unyielding dominance. Samuel had trained for years, mentally and physically, to withstand any enemy. But now he was at their mercy, caught and powerless, bound by restraints he could barely comprehend. Suddenly, a whisper of movement broke the silence. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and a tall figure stepped through. Samuel tensed, instinctively trying to prepare himself despite his restraints. He didn't need introductions to know who she was. She was Commander Russia, a name that struck fear into the hearts of soldiers across entire star systems. Her reputation preceded her as a ruthless leader who wielded power and authority with unmatched precision. And now she was here, standing right in front of him. Commander Russia's presence filled the room. Her tall, slender figure was clad in an armor that seemed to merge seamlessly with her dark blue skin, which glistened under the artificial lighting. Her piercing black eyes studied him with an intensity that made him shiver, as though she was dissecting him mentally, peeling back layers to reveal his every secret. Samuel clenched his jaw, refusing to show weakness, even as her gaze seemed to search his soul. For a long moment neither spoke. She simply watched him, her face an unreadable mask. And then, with a slight tilt of her head, she took a step forward. Each step echoed in the quiet chamber, amplifying the tension between them. Samuel's chest tightened as she stopped mere inches from him, close enough for him to see the fine details of her expression. But there was no mercy, no warmth in her gaze, only cold calculation. "You are the human they call Samuel," she said, her voice low and authoritative. There was no question in her tone. She already knew the answer. "Your kind has proven interesting." The way she said the word made his skin crawl. He held her gaze, his eyes narrowing. If she expected him to crumble under her stare, she'd be disappointed. "What do you want with me?" he demanded, his voice steady despite his situation. Her lips curved into a faint, almost mocking smile. "I want information," she replied, her tone as sharp as a blade. "Your species is hiding something that gives you hope despite overwhelming odds. I intend to find out what that is." He met her gaze without flinching. "Do your worst," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not telling you anything." A glint of amusement flickered in her eyes. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Oh, I don't need you to tell me willingly. You'll see, human. Everyone has a breaking point." As she circled him, her movements were slow and deliberate, each step calculated to instill fear. But Samuel was unyielding, his resolve hardening with every word she spoke. He wouldn't let her see his fear. He was a soldier, trained to withstand torture, to protect his comrades and his home. Whatever she wanted from him, she'd have to work for it. But then, something unexpected happened. She stopped just behind him, so close he could feel her presence without seeing her. And suddenly, he felt a light touch, a brush of her fingers against his arm. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a jolt through him, something foreign, unsettling. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, catching a fleeting look of surprise on her face. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by her steely composure. The room fell silent again, the air thick with unspoken tension. Something in that brief contact had shifted the balance between them, a crack in the facade she wore so well. And as she resumed her place in front of him, Samuel noticed the faintest hint of hesitation in her eyes, as if she, too, was caught off guard by her own actions. "Tell me about your military's next move," she demanded, her voice colder, as though compensating for her momentary lapse. He looked back at her, defiance burning in his eyes. "I told you I'm not telling you anything." Her eyes flashed with frustration, a rare crack in her usually flawless demeanor. She took a step back, crossing her arms as if trying to distance herself. But Samuel could see through it. Something had shifted in her, a change that even she didn't fully understand. "You humans are stubborn," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Samuel smirked, sensing the faintest shift in power. "We had to be." Commander Rush's expression hardened, but beneath her stern exterior, Samuel caught a glimpse of something more, an uncertainty she was struggling to contain. And as their eyes met again, he felt an inexplicable pull between them, something beyond their roles as captor and captive. "Why are you hesitating?" he asked, his voice low, testing the boundaries of this strange new dynamic. Her jaw clenched, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of answering. But then she shook her head, turning away, as though refusing to acknowledge the question. Yet, even as she stood with her back to him, her shoulders tense, Samuel could feel the tension simmering between them, growing stronger with every passing second. The silence stretched, charged and electric, until finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't feel this way." Her words were laced with confusion, as if she was admitting something even she couldn't fully comprehend. Samuel's eyes softened, his curiosity growing. "Feel what way?" Russia turned to face him again, her gaze intense, her expression torn. "Our people, we evolved past these distractions," she murmured, almost as if talking to herself. "Emotion, physical desire, they were weaknesses, discarded long ago. And yet," her voice trailed off, leaving her unspoken thoughts hanging in the air. In that moment, Samuel realized that her struggle was not just with him, but with herself. Whatever she was feeling, it went against everything she had been trained to believe, everything she had known. And as he looked into her eyes, he saw the conflict within her, a battle between her rigid sense of duty and the strange, unfamiliar pull she couldn't ignore. "This doesn't have to be a weakness," he said gently, surprising himself with the tenderness in his tone. "Sometimes connections make us stronger." She shook her head, a hint of fear flickering in her eyes. "You don't understand. If my people found out," her voice faltered, her gaze dropping as if she couldn't bear to finish the thought. Samuel's heart pounded as he absorbed the weight of her words. She was caught in a web of her own making, trapped between her duty and a desire she could barely acknowledge. And as he watched her, he felt his own defenses beginning to crumble. For the first time, she wasn't just his captor. She was someone grappling with the same conflicts and vulnerabilities as him, someone who, despite everything, was just as human in her struggles. The silence between them deepened, charged with unspoken understanding. And in that quiet moment, Samuel felt the walls between them begin to fall, one fragile piece at a time. Bound by duty, torn by desire. As the tension between them simmered, the room seemed to pulse with an energy neither could ignore. Commander Rush's gaze lingered on Samuel, her normally unyielding expression softened by the flicker of something she didn't quite understand, a vulnerability foreign to her disciplined existence. She was a commander, a pillar of Eshtari dominance, someone who should be devoid of emotional entanglements. And yet, she could not ignore the pull, the strange force that had drawn her toward this human soldier, a mere prisoner of war. Samuel could see the struggle in her eyes, the barely concealed conflict warring within her. He felt his own heart racing, both out of confusion and something else he could not yet name. Here was a being who had brought terror to his people, someone trained to suppress any weakness. And now she was standing before him, exposed in a way that felt as fragile as glass. He hadn't imagined this, hadn't thought for a moment he'd be able to see past the Eshtari's steely, unbreakable surface. "Why did you hesitate, Commander?" Samuel ventured, his voice steady but curious, probing the boundaries of this new and shifting dynamic. Russia's eyes narrowed at the question, and she took a sharp, grounding breath. "Do not think this changes anything," she replied, her tone hard and defensive. But her words felt hollow, as if they were more a reminder to herself than a warning to him. She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers as if they had betrayed her by reaching out to him in that brief, unguarded moment. With a deliberate step forward, Russia closed the distance between them once more. She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that seemed almost hesitant, like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't fully comprehend. Samuel held her gaze, his own curiosity mirroring her uncertainty, and he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the Eshtari. "Your people, they see emotions as a weakness?" Samuel asked, probing the silence. "We evolved beyond such distractions," she replied, her voice strained, as if she were repeating a lesson ingrained in her from birth. "Emotions cloud judgment, create division. They are unnecessary." But even as she said it, Samuel could see the doubt flickering in her gaze, the subtle crack in her ironclad belief. "Maybe that's true," he said softly, "but sometimes emotions bring people together. They create something stronger, something that can't be destroyed by tactics or weapons." His words hung in the air, heavy and challenging, as if daring her to question everything she had been taught. Russia's jaw tightened. "Human ideals," she said dismissively, though her tone held a trace of uncertainty. "Your kind clings to sentiment, to fleeting attachments. That is why you lose." She spoke as if trying to convince herself, but Samuel noticed her gaze waver, just for a second. "Maybe," Samuel replied with a slight smile, "but it's also why we keep fighting, no matter the odds." The intensity of his words seemed to catch her off guard, and she looked at him with a hint of frustration, mingled with something else. She had expected resistance, perhaps, but not this calm defiance, this unyielding belief in something intangible. As she struggled to process her own response, Samuel could sense the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was no longer the merciless commander here to extract information. She was someone wrestling with her own convictions, her own buried desires. Abruptly, she stepped back, turning away from him as though trying to regain control. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until finally she spoke, her voice quiet and distant. "I have never felt this way before," she admitted, almost as if the words pained her. "It is wrong. Against everything I have been taught. I should be focusing on duty, on loyalty to my people." Her words wavered, and Samuel caught a glimpse of the internal battle raging within her. "You can't deny what you feel," he said gently. "You may try to suppress it, to bury it, but it's there. And maybe it doesn't have to be a weakness." The notion lingered in the air, challenging the very fabric of her upbringing. Russia took a shuddering breath, her back still turned to him, shoulders tense. "I am a commander, Samuel. I do not have the luxury of such indulgences. I am bound by my duty. My loyalty is to my people, my purpose clear." Samuel hesitated before responding, carefully choosing his words. "Loyalty doesn't mean giving up what makes you whole," he said quietly. "Maybe what you're feeling doesn't weaken you. Maybe it makes you stronger." He could see her tense at his words, her stance rigid, yet he sensed that she was listening, truly listening. Russia turned back to him, her eyes dark and troubled, reflecting a depth of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now. She took a hesitant step closer, her gaze locked onto his as if trying to understand something unfathomable. "What if you're wrong?" she whispered, almost to herself. "What if this connection is nothing but a weakness that will destroy us both?" Samuel met her gaze without flinching. "Then let it," he replied, his voice a steady anchor in the sea of her doubts. "But at least we'll know what we're fighting for." A flicker of anger crossed her face, mingling with the confusion, the vulnerability that was so alien to her. She looked down at her hands, clenching them into fists, as though trying to ground herself in the one thing that had always brought her certainty, control. But even as she tried to reassert her dominance, Samuel could see the cracks forming, the fortress she had built around herself beginning to crumble. Without warning, she leaned closer, her face mere inches from his, her breath rushing against his skin. He could see the tension in her expression, the way her black eyes seemed to search his face for something, an answer or a reason to pull back. But there was no going back. They were on the edge of something uncharted, something that defied logic and duty alike. Slowly, hesitantly, her hand reached out, fingers hovering near his cheek, as though touching him might shatter her entirely. Samuel felt his heart pound in his chest, a quiet thrill mingling with his own uncertainty. And then her fingers brushed against his skin, a light, hesitant touch that sent a jolt through them both. Rasha's breath hitched, and she pulled back as though burned, her eyes wide, filled with confusion and something akin to fear. But Samuel saw something else beneath that fear, a spark of curiosity, a hunger that went beyond simple desire. She wanted to understand, to experience, and it was tearing her apart. He looked into her eyes, his voice steady and soft. "You're not bound by anyone's expectations, Rasha. Not here. Not now." She closed her eyes briefly, her jaw clenching as though fighting an internal war. When she opened them again, they were filled with resolve, a quiet strength that surprised him. Slowly, she reached out once more, her touch now bolder, more certain. Her fingers traced a line along his jaw, lingering as though memorizing the feel of his skin. And in that moment, the tension between them snapped, replaced by an understanding that transcended words, culture, even their species. Their breaths mingled in the small, confined space, and the room seemed to shrink around them. Samuel felt his own resolve wavering, caught in the intensity of her gaze, the warmth of her touch. In that instant, he saw her not as a commander, not as his captor, but as someone just as lost and vulnerable as he was. And he knew, deep down, that this connection between them, fragile as it was real. She leaned in, her face close to his, her gaze locked onto his lips as though fighting an invisible pull. And then, as if surrendering to a force beyond her control, she closed the gap, her lips brushing softly against his in a tentative, searching kiss. It was a gesture laced with uncertainty and defiance, and yet there was a depth to it, a hunger that belied the fragility of the moment. The kiss was brief, but it felt like an eternity, a silent confession of everything they couldn't put into words. When she pulled back, her eyes were filled with a vulnerability that made Samuel's heart ache. She looked at him, her expression torn, her breathing uneven, as though struggling to process what had just happened. "This changes everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though speaking the words might shatter the fragile connection they had forged. Samuel met her gaze, his voice steady. "Yes, it does." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their actions settling in. The boundaries that had defined them, the lines of captor and captive, enemy and adversary, were now blurred beyond recognition. And as they stood there, caught in the throes of something neither could fully understand, they both realized that there was no turning back. In that fleeting, silent moment, they were no longer bound by duty or loyalty to their people. They were simply two souls, adrift in the vastness of the universe, brought together by fate and held captive by a connection neither could deny. And as they looked into each other's eyes, they knew that, no matter what lay ahead, they were bound by something far deeper than words could express. The fractured allegiance. The kiss lingered in both their minds, an undeniable truth between them that neither duty nor decorum could erase. The air in the chamber was charged, alive with an energy that defied logic, and as Russia pulled back, she found herself torn, adrift in a storm of emotions she had long believed to be obsolete. Her hands, which had brought countless enemies to their knees, now trembled with the weight of a choice she couldn't fully comprehend. For Commander Russia, these feelings were forbidden. The Eshtari had moved beyond emotion generations ago, abandoning the frailty of attachments to embrace a cold, calculated existence. In their society, love, desire, even curiosity outside the scope of duty, were relics of a past considered weak. And yet, in this chamber, facing this human who should have been nothing more than her enemy, Russia felt something awakening, something long suppressed in the depth of her being. She hadn't asked for this, she hadn't prepared for this. Samuel watched her struggle, noting the turmoil in her black eyes. They flickered between fear and desire, between duty and defiance. Bound and still under her control, he felt an odd sense of empathy, seeing the commander's internal battle as though it mirrored his own. He was her prisoner, technically, yet the chains that bound them both seemed far greater than physical restraints. "You're fighting yourself," he said, his voice a gentle accusation, not out of cruelty but out of an understanding he couldn't deny. Russia's eyes snapped to his, her face hardening, a flash of her unbreakable commander mask slipping into place. "I'm fighting for control," she replied sharply, though her voice betrayed her. There was no denying the tremor in her tone, the hint of something human lurking beneath her steely surface. She took a step back, as if putting distance between them would erase the memory of their closeness. "You're right to want control," Samuel continued, undeterred. "But what if, for once, there's a strength in letting go? In understanding that you're not bound by your people's rules, not here." Her jaw clenched, and for a moment he thought she might lash out, put an end to the strange, uncharted connection between them with a single command. But instead, she took a slow, shaky breath, her gaze searching his face, her mind racing. She had given countless commands, made life-or-death decisions in the heat of battle, but here, now, the decision to step toward him again, to close the distance once more, was harder than anything she had ever faced. "What does this mean?" she whispered, her voice vulnerable, uncertain. It was an admission she'd never make in front of any Eshtari, not even her closest allies, yet here she was, sharing it with a human, an enemy soldier who had somehow become more than just another captive. Samuel shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "But maybe we don't need to know right now. Maybe it's enough that we're here, together, that for once, we're free from our roles. Just two people trying to make sense of something bigger than both of us." Russia's gaze softened as she processed his words, and for a moment the tension between them eased, replaced by a quiet understanding, a fragile truce that defied their allegiances. She could feel her walls crumbling, the barriers she had so carefully erected around herself weakening. She had been raised to see humanity as inferior, as beings clouded by emotion and weakness. Yet here was Samuel, strong in ways she had never known, resilient in his defiance, and now she couldn't deny the respect, the curiosity, and the undeniable attraction she felt toward him. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor outside. Russia stiffened, her expression instantly shifting to one of alertness. Instinctively, she took a step back, regaining the composure she had momentarily lost, her body language a fortress of authority once more. "Someone's coming," she muttered, her voice all business now, though a hint of hesitation lingered in her eyes. She had never been uncertain in her duty before, yet here now, the thought of what another Eshtari might see, what they might think, gnawed at her. Samuel's gaze sharpened. He understood the stakes. If another soldier found them here like this, the consequences would be dire, not just for him, but for her as well. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the fear of what her own people might do if they suspected she had betrayed them, even in the smallest way. "Commander Russia," he said softly, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to pretend." She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to let her guard down again. "You don't understand, Samuel. To show vulnerability, to appear compromised, it's a death sentence in my world." "Maybe it doesn't have to be," he replied, his voice steady and calm. "Maybe it's time someone showed the Eshtari that strength isn't about suppressing every feeling." Russia looked away, her expression unreadable. She knew he was right in a way, but to act on that belief would be to risk everything, her career, her standing, even her life. Yet, the thought of returning to the emptiness, to the cold, calculated existence of duty above all else, felt unbearable now. The footsteps grew louder, and the decision was forced upon her. She squared her shoulders, her face hardening as she braced herself. A moment later, the door hissed open, revealing one of her officers, a towering Eshtari with piercing red eyes that took in the scene before him with suspicion. "Commander," he said, his voice laced with formal respect but tinged with unease. "Is everything under control?" "Yes," she replied, her tone clipped, professional. "The human is restrained. I am questioning him." The officer's gaze flickered to Samuel, lingering on the subtle tension between them, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Samuel met the officer's stare with quiet defiance, understanding that a single wrong move could shatter whatever tenuous trust he and Russia had built. "If you require assistance, Commander, I am here," the officer said, his tone respectful but his eyes sharp, searching for any hint of weakness. Russia held her ground, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. "That won't be necessary," she replied curtly. "You are dismissed." The officer hesitated, his gaze darting between her and Samuel, as if sensing the undercurrent of tension between them. But he nodded, his expression reluctantly respectful, and turned to leave, casting one last, suspicious look over his shoulder as he exited the room. As the door closed, Rasha released a slow breath, her shoulders sagging ever so slightly, the weight of her decision bearing down on her. She turned back to Samuel, her expression unreadable, yet her eyes were haunted, filled with the unspoken fears she couldn't voice. "They will question this," she murmured, almost to herself. "They will question me." Samuel looked at her, understanding dawning. "So, what will you do?" Her gaze flickered with uncertainty, a vulnerability she couldn't fully hide. "I don't know," she admitted, the words barely a whisper. "For the first time in my life, I don't know what to do." Samuel felt a pang of empathy, recognizing the weight of her struggle. Here was a woman who had spent her entire existence as an unshakable force, someone whose identity was tied to duty and honor. Now, for the first time, she was questioning it all, wondering if there might be something more, something worth risking everything for. "Russia," he said gently, his voice steady, "you're not alone in this." She looked at him, a flicker of something indescribable crossing her face. She took a hesitant step closer, as if drawn to him by an invisible force she couldn't resist. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly, until her fingers brushed against his once more, a silent acknowledgement of the connection between them. In that moment, words became unnecessary. They stood together, bound by something intangible, something that defied logic or reason. They were enemies by circumstance, yet allies in a shared struggle for understanding, for truth. And as their eyes met, they both understood that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The world outside that chamber, the war, the conflict, the expectations of their respective people, seemed to fade into insignificance. Here, in the silence, they found a rare, fragile solace. And for that brief, stolen moment, it was enough. The chains we choose. As the dim light flickered in the chamber, Russia felt her grip on the hard-won discipline she had cultivated her entire life slip, piece by piece. In the quiet that followed her officer's departure, she stood mere inches from Samuel, her hand still lingering close to his, as though letting go might break whatever fragile thread connected them. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting instincts, duty, fear, and the undeniable pull towards something she couldn't name. She was the commander of an Eshtari fleet, raised to be a symbol of strength and authority, yet here she was, standing vulnerable before an enemy soldier, each of them held captive by something beyond physical restraint. Samuel watched her, his gaze steady but gentle, recognizing the storm behind her eyes. Though he was still bound, it was she who seemed trapped, her internal battle written across her face. The harsh facade of the formidable Eshtari commander had crumbled, leaving only Russia, a woman standing on the precipice of her own beliefs, facing the daunting prospect of change. Why do you care? She asked, her voice quiet, barely audible, as if voicing the question might fracture the delicate truce between them. Samuel's eyes softened, sensing the vulnerability she was offering, raw and unguarded. Because I know what it's like to question everything you've been taught to believe in, he replied, his tone steady but laced with an empathy that seemed to disarm her. To wonder if maybe there's something else, something worth breaking the rules for. Russia's jaw clenched, her gaze dropping to her hands. You don't understand. For us, deviation is weakness. The HFY have survived by purging sentiment, by embracing control above all else. To question that, to question myself like this. She trailed off, struggling to express a vulnerability she hadn't known was within her. In her world, to admit such feelings would be to lay her life on the line. But have you ever asked yourself what you're giving up by suppressing those feelings? Samuel pressed, his voice gentle yet insistent. Have you ever questioned what it means to be HFY, to be you, outside the boundaries of duty? Her gaze snapped back to his, anger flaring in her eyes, though it was directed inward rather than at him. You speak as if freedom is so simple, she muttered, her tone bitter. For me, it's not a choice, it's survival. If my people found out, if they even suspected that I'd let a human like you close, she swallowed, as though the thought itself burned her from within. Her authority, her rank, her life, all of it would be stripped away in an instant. And yet, here you are, Samuel replied softly, holding her gaze. In this room, there are no rules but the ones we choose to follow. Whatever brought you here, whatever pull you feel, it's real, Russia. And it's yours, no one else's. The words settled between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. She looked at him, eyes wide, as if seeing him for the first time. The emotions she had worked so tirelessly to bury were now alive, filling the air around them with a raw, unfiltered intensity that defied everything she'd ever known. She could see it in his eyes, too, an understanding, a willingness to meet her where she was, even if it meant treading into dangerous, uncharted territory. She took a step closer, reaching out tentatively, her hand finding his in the dim light. For a moment, they simply stood there, hands entwined, sharing a silence that was both terrifying and liberating. In that single touch, she felt the weight of years of duty fall away, leaving only the fragile, fleeting sense of connection they forged in the midst of conflict. You could still escape, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. This connection, it doesn't make you any less my prisoner. Her words held a warning, a reminder that their situation was far from safe, that whatever comfort they found here was temporary. Samuel shook his head, his voice steady as he replied, I'm not trying to escape Russia. Not from you. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise. I'm here because, somehow, in the strangest way, this feels real. You feel real. Her breath caught, a small tremor shaking her resolve as she absorbed his words. In that moment, she felt more seen, more understood than she had in her entire life. Her heart pounded, a surge of unfamiliar warmth filling her chest. And yet, the fear remained, the terror that by embracing this, by allowing herself to feel, she might lose everything that had defined her. But then Samuel's voice broke through her doubts, steady and calm. Russia, what if you were more than just what they trained you to be? What if there was a part of you, beyond the commander, that could be free? He tilted his head, his gaze intent, challenging her in a way no one else ever had. What would that look like? Russia looked away, her throat tightening. I don't know. I was never given a choice. From birth, I was taught that the HFY way was my way, that to question it was to invite destruction. And now I don't know if I can keep up the charade, knowing there might be something more. Silence fell over them, a shared understanding thickening the air. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, and then she met his gaze once more, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. What I feel for you, Samuel, it's dangerous. It could destroy us both. He held her gaze, his expression unyielding. Then let it. He reached out with his free hand, gently cupping her face, his touch as soft as the words that followed. "Let whatever this is change us. I'd rather face the unknown, Russia, than go back to pretending this doesn't matter." In that moment, her resolve shattered. She leaned into his touch, her eyes drifting closed, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to feel fully, to surrender to the emotions she had long denied. She felt his thumb brush gently against her cheek, a simple touch that somehow held the weight of a lifetime of choices. And then the door to the chamber burst open once again, shattering the moment. They sprang apart, both of them instinctively stepping back as another Eshtari soldier strode into the room. This time it was Officer Malik, one of her most trusted lieutenants. His expression was hard, his sharp red eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. "Commander Russia," Malik's voice was clipped, tense, with a note of suspicion lacing his words. "We have been summoned. The High Command demands your immediate presence. They suspect discrepancies in your conduct." Russia felt the blood drain from her face, a chill settling over her. High Command. They had begun to suspect, begun to question her loyalty. She had known this moment might come, but she hadn't expected it so soon, hadn't been ready to face the consequences of the connection she had let grow here in this hidden chamber. "I understand, Lieutenant Malik," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. She squared her shoulders, nodding once, her gaze flickering back to Samuel for the briefest moment, as if silently apologizing. But Malik's gaze caught the look they shared, and his suspicion deepened, his expression hardening. He took a step towards Samuel, his posture aggressive. "This human has been a disruption from the beginning. We should terminate him and be done with it. He has served his purpose." Rush's heart seized at the words, a surge of protectiveness rising within her. Before she could fully process her actions, she stepped between Samuel and Malik, her expression fierce, her voice steely. "No, he is my prisoner, and he will remain under my watch. That is my order." Malik hesitated, his eyes narrowing, clearly unsettled by her defense of the human. "Commander, with all due respect," the High Command ruled. "Are you questioning me, Lieutenant?" she interrupted, her voice like ice, her gaze unwavering. Though her heart pounded in her chest, she knew she could not afford to show even the smallest crack in her authority. Not now, not here. Malik's face tightened, but he inclined his head, his voice reluctant as he replied, "Of course not, Commander. I am simply carrying out my duty." With one last suspicious glance at Samuel, he turned on his heel and left, leaving them once more in the charged silence of the chamber. The door closed, and Russia exhaled slowly, the weight of what she had just done settling heavily on her shoulders. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. The High Command would scrutinize her every move now, and any hint of weakness could seal her fate, and Samuel's. She turned back to him, her expression filled with both fear and resolve. "They're watching me," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "They will be watching you too." Samuel nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "Then let them," he replied softly, his gaze steady. "Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere, Russia, not unless you tell me to." A flicker of emotion crossed her face, a blend of gratitude and sorrow. In that moment, she knew that this connection, however dangerous, however forbidden, was worth every risk, every sacrifice. She would face the consequences, the scrutiny, the threats, if it meant holding onto even a fragment of this truth, this shared understanding that had ignited something inside her she hadn't known existed. They were bound by their choices now, bound by the chains of loyalty and defiance, bound by a truth they could no longer deny. And as Russia took a step closer to Samuel, reaching for his hand once more, she knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, even if it led them to the very edge of destruction, the edge of betrayal. As Russia stood alone with Samuel in the now silent chamber, the weight of her choice pressed upon her, heavier than any burden she had carried in her life. She looked down at his hand, still in her grasp, and for a moment she let herself believe in the impossible, that they could defy everything that stood between them. But the shadows of her decisions loomed large, and she knew the walls around them were closing in. High Command had already cast its suspicions. A defense of this human prisoner would not go unnoticed. Samuel sensed her hesitation, the flicker of doubt in her eyes that hinted at the struggle within her. He could see how her loyalty to her people and the connection she felt for him warred against each other, tearing at the person she had built herself to be. Yet, in her grip on his hand, he could feel her defiance, a strength that he knew ran deeper than duty. "Russia," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "Whatever happens next, you're not alone. We face this together, or not at all." She swallowed, her gaze piercing into his. "You don't understand, Samuel," she whispered, her tone edged with desperation. "My people, they don't just punish betrayal, they erase it. They wipe every trace of it from history, from existence." She released his hand, pulling back as if afraid to let herself linger too close. "I'm risking everything by allowing this, by allowing you. If they knew, if they suspected even for a moment that I've hesitated, that I've let myself feel something." Her voice trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air. "Then why did you defend me?" he asked gently, his voice steady, his eyes searching hers for an answer she seemed hesitant to give. She hesitated, clenching her jaw, her body taut with restraint. "Because it's not just about me," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "In you, I see a mirror, a reflection of something I lost a long time ago. The freedom to choose, to question, to be more than just a tool of war. I defended you because you remind me that there's more to existence than loyalty without thought." Samuel's eyes softened, his heart pounding as he saw the struggle within her, a conflict as powerful as any battle he had fought. She was torn between loyalty to her people and the faint, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something else, something worth risking everything for. And in that moment, he realized that whatever lay ahead, they were bound by a connection that neither duty nor fear could sever. A sudden sharp hiss echoed through the chamber as the door slid open once more. Russia stiffened, her hand dropping to her side, and Samuel's pulse quickened as he recognized the figure who entered. It was not an officer nor a soldier. It was an eschari of high command, marked by the black insignia etched onto his chest armor, a rank that placed him among the elite of their society. The High Commander's gaze was cold, calculating, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. He was taller than most Eshtari, with an imposing presence that seemed to fill the room, his red eyes glinting with an almost predatory sharpness. Russia's face hardened, her stance shifting as she met his gaze with unwavering authority. "Commander Russia," he said, his voice smooth, but laced with an edge that made Samuel's skin prickle. "We received word of unorthodox methods in your interrogation." He looked from her to Samuel, his eyes lingering on the human with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Care to explain?" Russia held her ground, her face an unreadable mask. "I am utilizing every resource at my disposal to gather information from this prisoner," she replied coolly, her tone measured. "He has proven resistant to conventional methods. I believed a psychological approach might yield better results." The High Commander's gaze remained fixed on her, his expression inscrutable. Psychological approaches can be unpredictable, especially when dealing with inferior species. His eyes flicked briefly to Samuel, then back to Russia. "Tell me, Commander, are you certain your approach has not compromised your loyalty to our cause?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, and Samuel saw a flicker of something in Russia's eyes. A brief flash of fear, quickly masked by her unyielding expression. He could feel her tension, the weight of her people's scrutiny bearing down on her with relentless intensity. "I am unwavering in my loyalty to the Eshtari," Russia replied, her voice steady but edged with a subtle defiance. "My methods may be unconventional, but I have only one purpose here: to serve our people, to protect our way of life." The High Commander's lips curved into a thin smile, though his eyes remained cold. "And yet, your actions raise questions, Russia." He stepped closer, his gaze boring into hers with an intensity that seemed to test the very fabric of her resolve. "You are a commander of our fleet, chosen for your strength, your discipline. But discipline does not allow for softness, for sentimentality." His tone dripped with contempt, and Samuel felt a surge of anger rise within him, the urge to defend her, though he knew it would only worsen her predicament. Russia's face remained impassive, her gaze unflinching. "Sentimentality is not a weakness I possess, High Commander," she replied firmly. "I am devoted to my duty." The High Commander regarded her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and calculating, as though weighing her words against some unspoken standard. And then, with a flicker of something dark in his eyes, he nodded, though his expression remained hard. "Very well, Russia," he said, his voice cold. "But consider this your final warning. The Eshtari have no tolerance for deviation. One misstep, one sign of weakness, and you will face consequences more severe than you can imagine." He looked at Samuel, his eyes gleaming with disdain. "And as for this human, he is nothing but a distraction. Remember that." With that, he turned on his heel and exited the chamber, leaving the door hissing shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were bearing down upon them. Russia let out a slow, shuddering breath, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained from her body. She had faced down one of the highest authorities of her people and survived, but she knew it was a temporary reprieve. "They're watching you," Samuel murmured, his voice quiet but filled with a steady determination. "They'll be waiting for you to slip." Russia nodded, her gaze distant, her expression haunted. "I know," she whispered. "One wrong move, and they'll erase me from existence, make me nothing more than a memory." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a sorrow he had never seen in her before. "And they won't just kill me, Samuel. They'll strip me of everything that defines me, everything that makes me, me. It will be as if I never existed." Samuel felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him, the desire to shield her from the fate she faced, even if it meant putting his own life on the line. He knew that his people would do the same to him if they found him betraying their cause. They were both captives, bound by the expectations and fears of their respective worlds, yet in each other they had found a rare, fragile freedom. "Then let's find a way to survive this, together," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "We don't have to let them control us, Russia. We can make our own path, our own choices." Russia looked at him, her expression torn, her gaze flickering with a spark of hope that had long been buried beneath years of discipline. For so long, she had believed that loyalty to the Eshtari was her only purpose, her only reason for existing. But now, standing here with Samuel, she saw the faint glimmer of another path, a path she had never dared to consider. "We can't just run," she murmured, her voice laced with doubt. "They would hunt us, chase us to the ends of the universe. I can't ask you to risk that." Samuel took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not asking for an escape. I'm asking for a choice. If we stay here, if we keep pretending, we lose ourselves. But out there, maybe there's a chance to be free, even if it's only for a moment." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine it. The freedom to be more than a commander, more than a tool of war. The possibility of living, truly living, beyond the reach of her people's demands. It was a dangerous, reckless dream, but it filled her with a strange, exhilarating sense of hope. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, and she looked up at him, her gaze filled with a newfound resolve. "Then we'll face this together," she whispered, her voice steady, her hand finding his once more. "No matter what comes, no matter where it leads, we'll face it together." In that moment, the weight of their decisions, of their shared defiance, settled over them, binding them together in a way neither could deny. They were fugitives now, not just from their respective worlds, but from the expectations that had defined them for so long. And as they stood side by side, ready to face whatever lay ahead, they knew that their bond, fragile as it was, would be their greatest strength.